right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Learning Lab conversation today, asking the question, exploring the question, what is worship? For those of you who have been tuning in to these conversations for the past couple of weeks, you know that I am Pastor Jason Coker, lead pastor of the Oceanside Sanctuary, and as a part of our teaching series called Why Church, we have been having a weekly conversation with other church leaders from around the country, asking a series of questions about what the future of different aspects of church might be. And so we've talked about, what's the future of tradition and what's the future of the gospel. This week, we jump on with the question, what is the future of worship? So what is this sort of odd, strange things that Christians are in the habit of doing when they come together, usually on a weekly basis, and engage in all different kinds of practices that we generally collectively end up calling worship? My question today really is, what is the future of those practices? What's the future of those activities, given that increasingly the largest demographic of people in the United States are those who call themselves nuns, right? Which is not like the Catholic nuns that you think of when you hear that word originally, but the people who check that box on their census form that says that they are not a part of any particular religious tradition. That is the single biggest religious demographic we have in the United States now, bigger than any other group. And so as leaders of churches, we're constantly asking the question, how is it that what we're doing is in some way meaningful to people in the community who are increasingly rejecting those expressions of religious adherence? And so today we're going to ask the question, what is the future of worship? I have a bunch of guests joining me today as usual. So we're going to take a minute just to welcome them and say hello. I'm going to go around the room here, moving to my right, and we have the Reverend Dr. Michael Rayburn, who is the lead pastor at the Vineyard Church in Gainesville, Florida. Welcome, Mike. How are you today?
I'm doing good, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Good. Thanks for joining us from the East Coast. How's the weather there in Florida?
Hot, as usual. Rainy. It's been a lot of tropical weather. We're getting some bans from Storm Epsilon, I think. I've lost track at this point.
Yeah. It's been unseasonably hot here in Southern California for the fall, too. But we appreciate you joining us from the afternoon, from the future. You are literally joining us from the future. Speaking of which, Maria French is also joining us today. Also from the future, Maria French is the executive director of H&Co, which is an organization that curates conversations and courses and dialogues similar to this, questions about the future of faith and the future of people who consider themselves folks of faith. Welcome, Maria French. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm well. I really love your elevator pitch.
Is there like a job in that for me? Could I just go around and maybe intro you?
Star person, sure, yeah.
It would be my pleasure to do that. So speaking of calling from the future, what time zone are you in, Maria? Because I never can keep track.
I know. At the moment, I'm in Eastern Standard Time. I'm in New York. In UK soon, but hanging out in New York.
Okay. I know you're trying to make your way to the UK, but that hasn't come through yet, obviously. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited about you joining us today, so thanks for taking the time. And then we also have Reverend Tim Burnett, who is the curator at the Way Collective. The Way Collective is a new expression of faith birthed out of an older church called First Christian Church of Santa Barbara, up in Santa Barbara, California. And it's been really fun to watch Tim curate this birthing of something new in Santa Barbara. So I'm really excited to have him today. He always brings really great insight into these conversations. Welcome, Tim. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Can't complain. Healthy up here, and really glad to be with you all again. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And then last but certainly not least, we have Reverend Amy Pyatt, who is the co-pastor at First Christian Church in Granbury, which is in the Fort Worth area of Texas. Thanks for joining us, Amy. How are things in Texas?
Also hot, muggy. Yeah, it's like 85 and very tense because I live in a very red part of the country. And I think people are starting to feel a little freaked out about what's coming. And then, COVID weird too. Other than that, just swell.
Yeah. Well, do you mean people in Texas are feeling the political pressure too, just like everybody else?
I think so.
Uh-huh. And I know that this is not our conversation today, but like I'm fascinated that you're living in a state that is increasingly seen as potentially tipping from red to blue. There must be a lot of like anxieties in the community around that possibility.
I have seen more Trump parades via boat, via bike, via every mode of transportation. Actually, there's a woman that runs every day with glitter paint and red, white, and blue and a giant Trump flag. So every way that you can parade for Trump, I have witnessed in the last 10 days.
Right. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and go with this a little bit, if it's okay with you guys, because we're talking about worship and like you're describing a manifestation of worship, don't you think?
I think so. Yes.
Right. One of the interesting phenomenons of politics since 2016 and since like the advent of the Trump administration is that I'd never before in my life seen a candidate with their own flag that was being prominently displayed by their adherents. And like, I'm not picking on a Republican here. Like anybody who's tuning in here knows what my sort of political leanings are. So that's not a surprise to anybody listening, but I'm not picking on Trump per se. I'm just like super fascinated by this phenomenon that people who are behind Trump have like embraced this idea of like raising a flag, right? And a flag is a symbol of loyalty, a symbol of allegiance. I live in Oceanside, California, which is very like purple area politically, like increasingly blue, but still very red because one of the biggest military bases in the country borders our northern border here. That's Camp Pendleton. So it's a very military area of the country. And so one of the ways that that anxiety comes out is just like what you said, like if you go to our harbor, because we have a harbor in Oceanside, like all the really nice boats are flying Trump flags prominently. And every time we go to the harbor to like walk around, I'm sort of disturbed by what appears to me to be a kind of blatant expression of idolatry. I'm wondering if anybody else like has noticed that, and not just the Trump phenomenon, but like that tendency for that particular ideology to become a kind of worship. And how are you seeing that in your communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. When you said about the Trump flag that it's a certain type of manifestation of worship, I almost butted in and said, or idolatry. I didn't, but I'm glad that you ended there because I think there's such a fine line between worship and idolatry. And I think for me, when I think about, this kind of conversation, when I was kind of, musing in my own mind about some things I wanted to share, when we're having a conversation about worship and idolatry, I think I just want us to be honest about what it is we're doing when we do worship and what we're naming as worship. And it's okay that it is potentially for us. And it's okay that we manifest out of what makes us feel best or gives us the most transcendental experience or gives us the most emotionally connected experience. But I think it's important to just sort of be honest about that. And that's what that is that it's an experience for us. So yeah, I think that's my little 2 cents about the idolatry piece.
Yeah. So, I mean, I appreciate you pointing that out. I feel a little like I should say, like, isn't like one person's idolatry just another person's worship and like vice versa? Like, isn't worship just what Christians refer to as that activity that other people would call idolatry? Or am I wrong about that?
I mean, it's all a language game. It's all like hermeneutics and interpretation and the meaning that we give to things. But I mean, if we're talking specifically, as something we kind of lift up and above ourselves, and even more than that, I would say like up and above relationships and community. We'll just use the example of the Trump flag because it came up already. Like when you lift that up and above justice and relationships, and when it becomes so divisive, there are certain like checks and balances that you can put something through to see if it's an idol, and it can come out very clearly through the other end of that crucible. So sure, it's a language game, but I guess the age-old question of like the kind of fruit that it bears, is something we have to reckon with too. So.
I think one of the important questions to ask when we're trying to discern whether we're making something an idol or actually opening ourselves to transcendence is, where does it point? Does it point to a greater connection with life, to something that is open-ended and hopeful, or to staking a claim and a sense of permanence, ownership, empire, being right and making other people wrong, drawing lines in the sand?
So I really appreciate the imagery, Maria, that you used, and then Amy sort of piggybacked off of that to point out some of the explicit things that you sort of elevate that worship above, right? Because that image of a flag being raised up, I think, is actually really helpful to this conversation, Maria, as you pointed out, because it sort of asks the question, what is it that you're elevating above all else? And then, of course, Amy said that explicitly. And so if, again, to continue to pick on the Trump flag, if the thing that you're elevating above all else represents misogyny, represents throwing immigrant children in cages, intentionally separating them from their parents, not for any punitive reason or not for any just reason, but for a punitive reason, right? And actually as a deterrent to try to like make sure people don't try to cross the border illegally in the future because they know that their children will be intentionally separated from them if they do. Like we know that that was actually the intention of that policy, right? So every time you raise that flag, you're saying doing that is more important than being compassionate towards those who are fleeing maybe oppressive circumstances in another country, or like all the different things that you could say that Trump stands for, all of those things elevated above all else. You might, for example, say that more positively, like when I talk to people who support Donald Trump as Christians, they will say that one of the main reasons is because he puts America first, and they think that that's good and right, and that America should be put first above all other nations. And so that tells me that they're elevating America above all else in their lives, which again feels like idolatry, right? And so what is it then that we ought to be elevating above all else that will produce good outcomes, to sort of jump off of what both Amy and Maria have said? Like they're pointing towards the outcomes of elevating something above all else.
Could I maybe make a comment here to just like a distinction before we move to what we could elevate up that might be better than Trump? You know, I want to just maybe offer up an observation that I don't think that Trump or the Trump flag, or even being having a sociocultural identity as a Republican is the idol. I think that what we're seeing manifest as like something like Trump worship or American nationalist worship is actually capitalism masquerading as religion. And so for me, I think of, you know, Walter Benjamin's work on this, and Giorgio Agamben, who's an Italian philosopher, who says that capitalism is really a religion, literally the most fierce and implacable and irrational religion that's ever existed, and that a permanent worship is observed in its name. And it's a worship whose liturgy is labor and its object is money. And so he makes this conclusion of saying that God did not actually die, as in, you know, Nietzsche's famous statement, but that God was actually transformed into money. And so I think that on some level, Trump represents, is sort of the talking head of the debt relations that we all are in this capitalist system. And there, I mean, I could talk about this for hours. I know it's not the topic today, but I think it's relevant in the sense that we even talked about the nuns at the outset here. And it's my contention that on some level, I think what more and more nuns are actually opting out of is the God of capital. And they're realizing the falsification that actually is, and that the evangelical sort of matrix on the whole is in part a part of a much larger conglomerate hairball that perpetuates an authoritarian narrative that holds up the God of capital more than even like the Hebrew God or the God that's reflected in Jesus, that, you know, And so for me, I just wanted to name here at the outset that part of my analysis of this is to name that this religion that we're seeing, or this sacred desire that we're seeing pointed toward Trump, is actually worshiping money. And Trump has called himself the king of debt. He's sort of the king of mammon in a sense in this regard. And that until we can realign our sacred desire towards something worth giving it to, and I think that's the question that you opened up, Jason, we need to just recognize where it's aimed right now.
I mean, does anybody disagree with that? That what Trump represents is sort of the idolization of capital or money, in terms of like how Americans have sort of just given themselves over to whatever will make them more powerful, or at least through money?
I don't disagree at all.
Yeah.
I mean, and maybe the easiest example of the moment is the counter argument to the horrific response to the coronavirus that our government has engaged or not engaged in, is like, well, the stock market is doing well. That's the first response when you talk about the fact that I think the New York Times is reporting today 285,000 people have died because of COVID-19. If we do a more accurate evaluation in the United States, and the response is like, well, no, the stock market is doing well, and that I think tells you all that you need to know, that yes, capitalism is a death cult, and we're on that board, and it's the opposite of anything that's communitarian or community building. Capitalism has to have winners and it has to have losers. It has to be divisive for it to work. There has to be a separation between labor as human resource that gets exploited by those who are doing the exploiting. So it's always divisive. And so I think both Maria and Amy mentioned that, the test is in the fruit. With the worship of any idolatry, and especially capitalism, is going to be divisive. It's going to divide you from other people. It's going to divide you from the environment, so that the exploitation of other people, the exploitation of nature, and those divisions are also going to, by their nature, divide you from the Creator, divide you from the God of the universe, and divide you from your own self. And so you wind up, and this is Nietzsche's wisdom for us, is that this divides the self into a place where we can't go without confronting the abyss, the abyss that's within us. And so the opposite of all that, the worship of the God that Jesus calls Father or Papa, will do the opposite. It will reconnect us internally to ourselves, that bifurcation of our souls. It will connect us to each other with no remainder that's not there. So there can't be any outsider. There can't be any them. There's only us, as Martin Buber, told us. It will reconnect us to nature. In any expression of Christianity that's not opposed to exploitation of the created order is a false Christianity. And then those things will add up to leading us to a reconnection to the Creator, to the God Jesus calls Father. And those go together. They're of a piece. You can't have one without the other. So you can't be personally, spiritually mature and hate your neighbor, is what 1 John tells us. If you say you hate your neighbor, then you hate God. And the one that we often leave out of that equation is the creation, is the created order, and it's been as exploited by capitalism as has human labor since at least the Industrial Revolution. And we've found ways to talk ourselves into that and to make that okay and to ameliorate that in some sense, and cope with it. But it's all just been coping mechanisms that allow us to go further down the road with our idolatry and not confront the deep evil and sin that we have bought into.
So I really appreciate how you took what Tim said and then you moved us into a conversation about how idolatry or false worship will create divisions between us and nature, between us and each other, even between us and ourselves internally, because that's definitely something that I was hoping we could explore a little bit today, is how at least a symptom of false worship is a continuing fragmentation, not just of ourselves, but a fragmentation of our communities, a fragmentation of our world, ecologically speaking. And I think like we can see all those symptoms rampant at work in us. And when I think about this, and as you were talking, I think for me at least, the first sort of Old Testament passage that leaps to mind is Isaiah 58, which talks about, of course, true and false worship. And this is, of course, within the context of like returning from exile, and the fragmentation or the disintegration of the Israelites as a people. And of course, God is, through the prophet, exhorting them to a true worship. And you hear this sort of thing, this sort of passage quoted a lot, Isaiah 58, verse 6, is this not the fast I've chosen, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. And that, I'm not going to read all of Isaiah 58, but I just want to point out that one of the symptoms that the prophet is trying to sort of surface here is that false worship produces the fragmentations and oppressions and enmities that we see rampant in our communities, right? And that brings to mind like the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, which comes along through the Mishnah about 100 years after Jesus. This notion that true worship, when it's our highest priority, right? When worshiping God is our highest priority, the end result, and all of you have said this one way or another already today, the end result is a repairing of the brokenness in the world, right? Like tikkun olam literally means to repair the world, to make it whole again, which is of course the Jewish sort of concept of shalom, right? Not peace as the absence of conflict, but peace as the ultimate fulfillment, the making whole of all things. And I'm wondering, like, if we can sort of reverse engineer idolatry that way, like, can we just look at all the things in our lives that we're doing that produce brokenness as a way of identifying what idolatry is? And if so, like, what are some of the things that you guys see as practices in our world that are obviously producing brokenness, and therefore we can easily, easily diagnose them as idolatry? What are those practices?
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on what my colleagues were saying about capitalism, and I know that we don't want to turn this, all into kind of like rage against the man sort of situation. We all live in a capitalist society. We all benefit from it. We're on this call because capitalism is alive and well. But when we do look at it, when we do examine it, it's more than just capitalism. It's the way capitalism has split and recreated itself through the generations. Franco Berardi, an Italian philosopher, he has a million books because he's been around forever, but one of his more recent ones, After the Future, he really interrogates digital capitalism, which is one of the latest forms of capitalism. And he indicts it with the fact that it has completely disintegrated and fragmented our humanity. And he's a philosopher of the Italian workers movement of the 70s. So for him, everything is about the worker and the common person. And he just talks about how, that 0-hour work week and how everything is contracted out to our parts and not necessarily the sum of who we are. And that sort of thing flows into every area of life. In the context of talking about worship, seeing it as kind of this experience that is sold to just a piece of us, it kind of meets with a piece of us that is longing to be whole, that is empty. When you think about the things that motivate us and your question about what fragments us, I think we can attribute a lot of things to like our basic fears and insecurities as humans. Why have we attached to capitalism? Because it feeds into this dream and this desire of being kept safe and being looked after and being, well kept in so many different areas of life. Trump promises that. And it's not about Trump. It's, as I think one of you said, the fact that he's a talking head, he is the manifestation of generation and decades of a certain type of thinking. So I look at him, I can't actually be angry with him because it's not him. And I am angry with him, of course, but it's all that he represents. And the hope in Baradi's thinking is, yes, okay, because digital capitalism has completely blown up our future, and because the promises of 20th century capitalism are not going to be fulfilled in the 21st century or ever, precisely because our entire future has been blown up, that's where we find our hope, is that we're at ground zero and we have an opportunity to refragment, recome together, reassemble, recreate, all in biblical language, to have all things be made new, that shalom of all of things coming together. We have an opportunity here. But I think, to go back to your question about, examining the fragmentation, we do have to sort of get down in the weeds of it and say, okay, where did this start? What is, the last 50 years of Western civilization look like? And how are these things manifesting? And essentially, what does it mean for our future? Because I think it's really easy to just look at the current state of events and be like, oh, this is hopeless, we're finished. But it's because we're finished right now, and it's because the promises of the 20th century weren't made good, that we can start anew now with hope for a future.
Okay, just to summarize then, like, part of what's fragmenting us is our own complicity and participation and reliance upon a system, a capitalistic system that intentionally fragments our lives, and like we sort of by necessity have to participate in order to survive, right? Any other thoughts on that, or other things that you see as practices that continue to fragment us in our lives today?
Well, there's to participate in it at this moment requires amnesia. You have to forget your own story. The average white person in America probably knows very little about their own heritage. I was reading something, I think, on Slate this week. We all think we have a Cherokee native somewhere in our family tree, and why we tell ourselves that lie. But the reality is we don't know where we came from, and we don't know our stories. I've been reading this wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she says, what we need is restoration, but before there can be restoration, there has to be restoration. We have to know the actual truth of our stories. And I think it goes further back than the 20th century, because the capitalist system that we're working in now was built on slavery. And so we have to go all the way back to, the 1500s. And so that's where a book like Willie James Jennings' The Christian Imagination is so helpful, because it begins to tell the story, begins to tell the theological and the religious story behind slavery and those business decisions that were made at the ultimate expense of humanity, both of those they captured and the captors themselves. And we've not been able to shake that off, because our system is still built on that basic exploitation of people. To this point now, and you're right, Jason, we kind of live in this system. And Maria said, we're on this call because of capitalism. And yeah, each one of us is using some device that was made with slave labor within the last 18 months. And everyone on this call knows that. It's not news to anyone. I say this at church all the time, at my church. We all know this. You're carrying around a device in your pocket that's worth $1,000 that was made by slave labor and people jumping off the building to kill themselves. And yet we keep doing it. We keep participating in it. And even myself, man, the iPhone 12 is out and I really want one. What is wrong with me? Wretched man that I am.
Well, okay. So again, I'm just to reiterate, right? To sort of keep relocating us in this conversation. You're saying additionally, another thing that we participate in that fragments us is participation in the willful loss of our story as people, right? Like I'm thinking, this makes me think of Hannah Arendt, which I don't know that I have time to talk about, but we could go there and talk about her emphasis upon, remembrance of past events that produce action, right? Who's thinking about that was really influenced by Walter Benjamin. I really appreciate that Tim brought him up. And all of that comes out of philosophical writing over and against a fascism that was becoming dangerous in Germany in World War II. Both of those writers were exiled from Germany because of the growing fascism in Europe. Benjamin killed himself because he couldn't escape it, right? Incredibly tragic story there, right? So I only mention that because it's important, I think, to know that the fertile thinking around these issues grows out of really urgent existential threats facing us, right? And I think that it's it's necessary to acknowledge that we are in a generation that's facing not quite the same threats, but we are facing existential threats in the form of fascism that's growing all over the globe, and also in the form like ecological threats like global warming. So I say all that to say, like, part of our way of escaping those threats is to find a news story, right? And that news story that we're all called to participate in, at least every one of us on this call, is whiteness. Like, whiteness is the story, especially in the United States, that replaces like our dislocation from our heritage.
Right.
And so
whiteness is the erasure of our stories.
Absolutely.
A white person has no story.
Well,
and so
yeah, or I might even say, like, it's the story that we don't need a story, right? Like, yes. I think we're buying into a narrative, even if it's a non-narrative, right?
Right. Right. That's what Howard Ross always says. That's the story we tell her. We know that we didn't have a story until we decided to have a story. I'm getting it wrong. The story that we had no story until we chose to have a story. That's whiteness.
Right. Okay.
And so the double move for us is remembering our actual story, how we got to here. And then we have to also re-remember the Christian story, because we've been lying to ourselves, and this may get back to worship and liturgy, but our liturgies have been lying to us about the story of the Christian faith for a long time now, such that most of our congregants don't really have any clue when they read scripture or hear a sermon, how to locate themselves within the story of Jesus Christ and the God he calls Father.
But haven't we cloaked those stories in capitalism and whiteness?
100%.
And I think we've cloaked them in individualism as well. We've totally turned anything having to do with scripture or Christianity into like the Jesus and me story, which makes it impossible to interpret it with any semblance of multi-dimensional meaning, or meaning that goes beyond one dimensionality, I should say.
Yeah, y'all are reminding me of George Erasmus, who's a Canadian Indigenous teacher, says that in a society, unless there's a common history that's shared, a common story, there can be no true community. And I think, that false narrative of white supremacy in our country, or whiteness, as you all are framing it, is a different history than many of the BIPOC folks who have experienced our country in the existential register and violence against their bodies for generations. So you have two competing histories, and part of the problem in our time of this fragmentation that we're talking about is that we can't share that common history until we get the facts right, and we'll keep buying into, or at least many of the white folks will keep buying into that revisionist history of the greatness of our country. So so that's one dimension for me that came up when y'all were talking. But the other one was, Jason, just sort of hitting at your original question of wholeness and fragmentation or brokenness. And for a moment, if you'll let me, I just want to problematize that duality a bit, because I think in my experience, and I think this goes along with sort of Cornel West's analysis of this idea of wholeness, as well as Bayo Akomolafe, who's another spiritual author and psychologist. Basically, that the idea of trying to find some preeminent wholeness or is a romantic modern project in one sense, and that life is really more a rupture than it is a rapture. That in a sense, for life to be alive and moving and teeming with creativity and becoming, there has to be an opening, or I call it a hole, WHOLE, at the heart of reality, more than an HOLE at the heart of reality, more than it is a WHOLE, and so in that sense, I just would want to hold together that part of our collective becoming as a society needs to have room for the breaking open of what is, so that we can actually move toward what could be, if that makes sense. And so for me, there's an invitation here, a holding invitation, for us to have a conversation about what is the rupture of our time? And I think that we've already been talking about it this whole time, which is capitalism, is whiteness, is white supremacy. And maybe part of becoming wholeness for our churches and for our society is acknowledging that we are being called out into a new place at every moment here. And that this exile or this fugitivity that we are endeavoring in is directly a fugitivity or an exile from capital, from white supremacy, from oppression and violent systems. And so for me, I just wanted to sort of name that to have that conversation about trying to find the wholeness or trying to find the brokenness, it's a little bit more entangled for me personally.
So I just want to like acknowledge that like 2.5 minutes ago, I stepped on Amy. So I'm really sorry, Amy. Like you were like jumping in to make a comment and I was like out of control on my end. So do you remember what you were going to say, or how would you like to jump in here?
No, it's fine. It's Zoom. It's the reality in which we live these days. I would say that y'all, I mean, I love this conversation, brilliant minds and the integration of so many great thinkers. But I'm thinking about people in my church listening to this. And what they would say to me is, okay, so what does this mean for what happens when we gather in some form to worship God? And that's a worthwhile question. I think biblically, I mean, we know all of creation is groaning right now, and that's part of what we're naming. And we need to acknowledge that, not just here, but in worship, in our bodies, in our lament, in our ritual. Because I think we are experiencing it, whether we can acknowledge, like whether we can articulate it or not, on a cellular level. And we need some form of expression for that, both individually and collectively, a call to get over ourselves, to crucify our egos and our own role in empire and consumption and capitalism and this death cult. Yes. But then what's next? If we're going to let go of this, what's going to catch us? What is going to hold us up? And so these ancient rituals that I think by and large the Reformation threw out need to be in some ways reclaimed or reimagined so that we can be embodied and worship God with our whole selves. So things like story, which was mentioned, table, embodied prayer, things that we just have forgotten over time and have been sort of, I think, overlooked as passé or just old-fashioned, can be reclaimed. And there's so much wisdom there in offering our whole selves to God collectively, corporately, and surrendering to mystery. So what does that look like? Whether it's in a home with 7 or 8 people around a table, or at a park where people are gathering safely distanced to sing songs, or in a sanctuary someday. How do we do that? How do we worship God in spirit and in truth? And I think that, I mean, it's all there in our sacred story and through these beautiful rituals and contemplative practices that have been handed down from our spiritual ancestors. But we still set ourselves up, clergy, to be the experts. And in some ways, I feel guilty of having then put myself up as an idol and having worship point to me. Who am I to speak on behalf of God? That is a really bizarre way to make a living, isn't it, friends? And yet, that's what we do. So what does that mean for worship?
You know, when you started, you asked the question, you know, what do we tell our congregation or the people that we're leading when it comes to worshiping God? How do we worship God? What does all this look like in a very practical sense? And my first thought when you said that was,
we lost you, Maria.
Oh, am I back?
You're back.
Okay. When did
first thought?
Thank you. Okay. My first thought when you said that was, well, I think we need to have a conversation about who and what God is, because I think that is a really misunderstood concept. And it's okay, because you talked about mystery. And I think more of us need to approach these topics and concepts with more uncertainty and more mystery and more unknowing and more deconstructing than we ever have. But it makes a conversation about what the future of worship is and how to actually worship difficult when our concepts of God are shaky. Now, on one hand, we can say, okay, well, hello, duh, we're talking about the Judeo-Christian God, or hello, we're talking about, you know, the God of Jesus Christ and the Gospels and those sorts of things. But it's increasingly becoming more and more diversified in terms of who people think that God is, or what that God is and what that God isn't. And so I'm just wondering if it's a good idea to even have the conversation about what it is we're worshiping and what's actually happening between us and the thing that we're worshiping during that time. So I don't know, just a question.
Can I offer a potential answer, at least within evangelical circles, which is all I know anything about? I think you mentioned, Maria mentioned deconstruction as part of it. I think that where we are now has to be the main part of it. That the job that we have as pastors is not just to help people cope through deconstruction, but to actively take our congregations through a deconstruction. If what we've been doing in liturgy and worship has been promulgating a lie, then the correction for that is to say, okay, well, let me take you back to the stories. This book's Braiding Sweetgrass, she says that our liturgies are how we remember to remember. And so we every element of our worship gathering should be like, okay, let's relearn the stories that you probably haven't learned or haven't been told properly. You know, we spent, I think, 12 weeks with Jesus and the woman at the well in John 4. And I spent an entire sermon being like, look, she was not, you know, a scarlet woman. Let's just stop right here, because I know you've been told this. And I know in your imagination, you hear Jesus say, you've had 5 husbands, and he's playing gotcha with her. And I've got to not just take that off the table. I have to like explain to you why that's wrong and the damage that that's done to you and to us as a whole before we can even move forward to understanding the dynamic that's going on in a passage that the fourth gospel writer gives, like, you know, 50 verses to, the majority of chapter 4, the very first, you know, major encounter Jesus has with a person who responds to him. Nicodemus ignores him. But it's such a significant moment in that gospel narrative. And it's like, you've got to re-understand this. And so I've walked people through deconstruction, at least at the pace that I feel like they're ready for. And sometimes I push them a little harder. And sometimes that means they need a break. I've pastored so many people that have been so wounded by their evangelical backgrounds that I've had to tell a few, like, look, I think you need like 6 months off. Like, don't come to church, don't read your Bible, just take a break. And then I check in on them to make sure I haven't like just sent them off into like Neverland. But sometimes people just need like a reset, a detox period. And that goes really well. And some folks are not as willing to confront the lie that they've been taught unless you really push it forward. And I think that's where we have to begin, because as Amy mentioned, like, the resources we need are in the scripture. We have a collection of writings by people living under oppression, and their encounters with the divine and with community, and with having to latch onto their stories just to survive and understand. And if we can, you know, approach these readings in an Ignatian way and understand where they were in the story, and understand what it's like to be, you know, modern day Roman Empire citizen in that story, then that helps us to see how this all works in our day, in our age. But that's a whole lot of rework that we have to do. And it also means that most of our resources, in terms of commentaries and especially popular Christian books, are just garbage. And you have to throw them out because a lot of what's been written, especially at the popular level, is just, it's the opposite of helpful. It's promulgating the lies. If you buy it at Lifeway, it's promulgating the lies. Can I say that?
You can say whatever you like, I think.
You just did.
Yeah. Lifeway is not one of my sponsors. So
okay, good.
So I'm hearing an interesting like a dynamic that's sort of, I think, a common thread through a lot of your comments. And I'll just borrow Tim's phrase, which is the whole at the center, right? Not the WHOLE, but the HOLE, whole, the emptiness at the center of the concept of God. I think that has been mentioned in a couple of different ways. One was the notion of lamenting. Amy brought up the importance of lament in worship. I think it was Amy brought that up, the importance of lament in our worship practices. I think lament acknowledges when we come into contact with the disappointment of what's not at the center of our relationship with God, right? And if we're all honest, we all have that experience, right? And so much of, I think, a false expression of worship has totally erased lament from our worship practices because we want to think that God provides all the answers and all the solutions. God always fills that hole with something, right? Mm-hmm. And then Amy also mentioned mystery, which I think is another way of thinking about the whole at the center, because we don't know what's on the other side of that mystery, right? So for functionally for us, when it's a mystery, it is emptiness. And then I think actually Mike's mention of deconstruction is pertinent to this too, because one of the things we do, and I really 100% agree with Mike saying part of our job these days is to help our people deconstruct. And everybody in my church knows that part of my story is leaving ministry and leaving church, not for 6 months, but for 5 years. And I just tell people, like, that's not an embarrassment on my CV. Like, I needed that in order to be a better follower of Jesus, right? And more people should be given permission, I think, to detox from church, however long that process takes, right? It doesn't have to take 5 years, but that's a kind of Sabbath, right? And there's something in the Bible about Sabbath, right? And so, like, I want to kind of like sort of connect all these dots a little bit as we're talking through this. And as Mike was talking about that, he talked about deconstruction as something that church can do intentionally. And I so agree with that. In fact, one of the things we talk about here from time to time is how the purpose of rituals in a rite of passage is to give people a safe space to be deconstructed. And that space of liminality that happens from one form of being to the next is literally an empty space. It's devoid of meaning, right? It's devoid of symbolism because that person is experiencing a redefinition of who they're going to be. And at least in my evangelical background, we have no pedagogy for walking people through those stages of their lives where they are supposed to leave behind one old construction and enter into a new construction. And so, like, how much of our worship practices could be an intentional space of liminality where we give people permission to experience chaos, permission to experience lament, permission to experience deconstruction, and we say it's okay. And not only is it okay, but it's necessary and important. And then all of that, of course, sounds a lot like kenosis, right? Like there is a self-emptying at the heart of God, which means that there should be some sort of emptying, self-emptying at the heart of what it means for us to worship God. And there's, all kinds of like interesting dynamics there. But I do think like this concept of emptiness at the center of our worship practice is a really powerful way to think about what people need in this time and in this space. And I'm wondering, now that I've sort of framed that, what do you see happening in your churches? What are you trying to do in your churches to foster that? Or what have you seen others do that you find inspiring or hopeful? Like, what are you seeing that's giving you hope for what we're talking about here?
I think one of the first points of connection for me, just picking up on these themes that we've been talking about here, is that I think what's happening in mass for a lot of nuns or people who are deconstructing or going on to that new migration into a new place of liminality in between, constructs or something, is what's happening is that we're losing God as an object. So think about a resonance with capitalism too. You're losing God as a commodity, as something that you can grasp. And so there's a contemplative invitation here into the emptiness that you beautifully framed up, Jason, into the deconstruction that all y'all have talked about. And what ends up happening, I think, in a life is that you need space to unravel. And that what I'm seeing happen in an actual community is that we've created a community of shared practices and values, but that basically that gathers around questions. So God then is not an answer to the question of the hole at the center of your being or the abyss at the center of your being. God is a sacralizing of that hole, that opening in you. That emptiness that you're tethered to, and so it's not an answer to a question or a firm foundation to stand upon, but it's supposed to, Bayo Komalafe again says that making sanctuary together or holding this space for each other is not about finding a space where you're safe from life or something, or safe from, everything that could hurt you, but that in a sense, sanctuary is a place where we can unravel together. And as we hold the great questions rather than try to answer them, and we continue on that process of de-objectifying God and entering into a practice, a communal pausing, a communal acknowledgement, a communal grief, whatever needs to be cultivated in a space together, I think that we're finding, at least in our community, that there is a bravery and a commonality that has been untapped in other forms of churching together. And so I think it could look a million different ways. And I think probably many of our communities create that sacred space with different liturgical moments, different movements, but that it just needs to be said that this is a time where we need to, continue to de-objectify our spirituality, continue to engage in a deeper desire than the desire for accumulation and consumption. And that I think it does take an intentionality when a community comes together to hold that space and even liturgize or craft that space together.
Again, I would say some really simple things that help us to be in our bodies and to be present. One of the great things about Catholic Mass is that it appeals to all the senses. You smell incense, you taste communion, you kneel corporately, you use your body in a way together to worship God. And it's not that we all have to do it that way, but there's so much to be learned from helping people to get in their bodies, to use our bodies to worship God, to be present. I would say silence is one of the most beautiful ways that we have of bearing witness and creating space for mystery to do what mystery needs to do. Giving people permission to unravel, to be a mess, to feel the chaos, and then to be held amidst chaos. Labyrinth walking, these are things that, they're in our tradition. We have them, we just have to kind of call them back up.
Yeah, I think the embodiment piece that you talk about, Amy, is huge, because I think so much of traditional worship is centered in having a transcendental experience, essentially having an out-of-body experience. We love the way that makes us feel. And so reorienting worship back into our bodies, which is, it's it sounds so simple, but it's so connected to everything else having to do with religion and our human experience. Because for so long, traditional Christianity has been about transcendence, and it has been about immateriality. When, a life worth living, and it's Schubert Ogden, 20th century theologian, that says faith is about the fact that life is worth the living of it. Life is actually about the material. Life is actually about the imminent and what's happening right now. And so, repositioning, re-steering that ship in a completely different direction, when so much of religion, and what we're talking about now is really kind of understandings of evangelicalism and worship. So much of that has been centered in otherworldly ideals. And so it's a really huge task, a slow one, and people that we lead in different ways. Can you hear me? I just saw you.
You just cut out for a half a second. Yeah.
Okay. And I think, kind of, Jason, going back to where you started the conversation in terms of the nuns and the duns and all of the statistics we've heard about over the last decade when it comes to that group, they're done with the comfort giving God. They're done with guy, the, God of theodicy and all of that. And so it becomes, for the nuns and the duns and this growing people, it becomes more about what happens under the notions of the God that they follow rather than the God that they worship. And so, again, just going back to that embodiment piece with Amy, I think a lot of the conversations have to start there, but it's hard because it does take deconstructing, it does take unlearning, it takes moving through our trauma, it takes reckoning with things like original sin and, believing that our bodies are unworthy and that there's nothing good in us unless we're redeemed by something outside of ourselves. No, our bodies are good and we can be in them. And, it's like, it's so connected. And that's why, it's like, when I talk like this, I'm like, oh my God, it's such a big task. There's so much to be done. But it is all so incredibly interconnected and interwoven. I think the embodiment piece is huge.
Yes. I'm just learning a little bit about polyvagal theory and this notion that we live in this constant state of fight or flight, and that we're always feeling either threatened or reactionary to being attacked. And if we can, again, give people ways to occupy the present moment, to recognize the space they're in, there's a part of our brain that will actually then allow us to be more present and not to run away. So I think that's something that if we can do that, then we can take people to other places. And then they just might, beyond any of our control, have one of those transcendent experiences, but you can't manufacture those. And that was the lie of worship, I think, for the last 50 years, that you could come in and sit down and do these things in the bulletin and magic would happen and you would feel better.
It's transactional. It goes back to the capitalism discussion, we were having earlier. So yeah, it's also connected.
Yeah, and not only is it transactional, but when we, I think, intuit that it is transactional, then we co-opt it for capitalistic purposes, right? And so, worship has become an industry in and of itself, and it is a very, very lucrative industry for some, certainly not for everybody who's involved in it. But just like every other industry, there are a few people who have managed to make a good deal of money from it while exploiting the labor of most of the people who are involved in it, which is capitalism, right? So when worship can be co-opted in that way, I think it's safe to say that it's not really worship anymore. And so
worship of something. It's worship of something else. It's always worship, but it's
which is idolatry, right?
Yeah, the object has you've lowered your aim considerably.
Yes. So it troubles me, and I know that it troubles all of you, that what we do in these spaces, in a very well-intentioned way, can so easily be turned away from what we're talking about, like these very effective bodily practices that will allow people to engage with the mystery of God in ways that help them to unravel in courageous spaces. Like all of that sounds really wonderful, but then it just so easily becomes its own idol, its own object of worship. And how do we guard against that as we move forward as, church leaders or parachurch leaders, I guess, to use an old term, and engage with people on the margins of our faith?
I think for us, I think a related issue to everything you said is control. If it's going to be transactional, it's going to be commodified, then there has to be a high level of control. And then you see in mega churches that are very successful, everything is controlled. I mean, they have, I don't know if you've ever participated in one of those, but they'll have everything planned out to the second, and nothing happens that's not known that it's going to happen. There is no liminality. There is no improvisation. It's all very scripted. And so our liturgical practices can seem scripted in that they're traditional, but I think for us, or anyway, the way we've guarded against that is to build in liminal space, to build in unscripted space, to make things more dialogical. And it's also been really helpful in terms of helping folks with deconstruction, because different people are in different places with that. They have different comfort levels. And so if it's just, me up there teaching and saying a bunch of things, then not everyone's receiving it. Not everyone's buying it. Some people want me to go further. Some people want me to slow down. And so what I had found, this is before COVID, of course, like I would share a bit, and then I would either break the congregation into small groups and have them talk about it, or we would just pass the mic around and take responses. And especially when we were dealing with like potential places where folks had been hurt by the church, it became very freeing to just say, does anyone want to share a story of your experience with this? And it's incredibly risky and vulnerable, but invariably I'd have at least one or two, and then usually the floodgates would open. A brave person would be like, yeah, I'll tell a story. And then what wound up happening over and over again was everything I had said was just like putting the ball on the tee. And then this person sharing their story, just, the whole room would be wrecked in the best way possible. But of course I had no control over that. And I don't know what the person's going to say. And it doesn't always go like I think it's going to go. But if I give it enough space and pastor it well, it always goes well, as long as I'm not cranky and trying to, control things. And then sometimes we just do the breakouts and let them talk among themselves. And sometimes I would do I'll have a point and then let them discuss it. And then if I can recapture their attention, I'll share another point and have them discuss again. Sometimes it's hard to bring them back once I've turned them loose. But what I'm finding is that people, especially the nuns and the duns, they're done with listening to one person yammer for half an hour while they sit and say nothing. They have thoughts, they have ideas, they have experiences of the divine and of life, and it has to be more dialogical. Now, we're in this space with COVID where we're not meeting in person at all because Florida's been such a mess and remains such a mess. But I'm already starting to think about when we get to post-COVID, maybe it looks like I keep recording my teachings and I post them like, hey, watch this before Sunday, and then Sunday we'll talk about it. And then we might be able to leverage this moment to move further into that moment. But whatever the future looks like for worship, it has to be more engaged and more dialogical and less controlled by a clergy person up front if it's going to be what the church needs for the 21st century, I think.
Okay, so I'm hearing a couple things. Number one, more embodied practices that engage all the somatic realities of what it means to be human, right? Like to be in a body. Amy brought that up, and that's making my old emerging church self very happy to hear her say that. So that's very cool. And then I'm also hearing about creating space that's safe for people to express their frustrations, their doubts, their emptiness, their rejections, whatever, right? Like, in other words, brave space or courageous space where people can unravel.
Just their thoughts and ideas, and making that
Yeah.
the center, not doing that like on Sunday night or on Wednesday night, but like that's Sunday morning. This is prime time. This is the center of what we do.
Yeah. And within that, I heard Tim saying that the church can provide the questions that are appropriate, but not necessarily the answers, right? But then also Mike talking about the importance of using a dialogical practice in community, which I agree is really important. But for me, I guess what I've heard or what I've experienced is that an inherent and actually a really important component of dialogue is that I ought to be able to offer my thoughts about the answers as a participant, not as a clergy person. I mean, I could as a clergy person too, if I do it carefully, but so I think there's an important element of that dialogue, any kind of dialogical movement, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, sort of framing. There needs to be like an offering of other possibilities. But what I'm hearing Tim say is that we can't impose what those possibilities are, right? So it needs to be a safe space where people can say, well, what if, in response to those questions, without being expected to toe the party line on orthodoxy or a creed. Is that right?
I mean, I would say that, yeah, it is. I think that we really do. I think many of us hear the need for dialogue and for allowing people to speak of their own embodied experience. And we try to shove it into a traditional worship service and then create little pockets where we can actually do that more. Mm-hmm. And I really think it's possible to redraw the lines of connection for community life. I think it's really possible to redraw the models for churching together. And so, like, I'm 100% on board with pretty much everything that's been shared. And I think, like, what our community has done is just made the dialogue the central piece of the community, of our night together. We have a meal. I mean, one of us from our community will frame up an idea, but it's really a spark of conversation. And then instead of the sermon being 30 minutes, the dialogue's 30 to 40 minutes. And then the community at the end shares the last word, like the collective wisdom of the community is then what our takeaway as a community is, rather than the pastor needing to be the talking head. And I'll say this, we've just tried to make it really difficult for you to come and consume something at our church. That's not the model, like, you have to participate. And it's unfortunate because for people who just are church shopping and want to come, consume a worship service, you can't walk into the Way Collective and sit down at a table and have dinner and be forced into dialogue with people without participating, so we've just tried to make it hard to again, commodify, objectify this worship experience, and instead, try to draw like a model that will draw people into, connection with each other. So
yeah, that sounds very much like what we do. And when we do it on Sunday mornings, like Tim is saying, the final word, the collective word of the congregation, we take that, and that's the blessing we put over the Eucharist when we share it. So we always take, we intinct, but the servers say a blessing over the bread and over the cup. And those blessings are what the congregation has decided are the two main takeaways or whatever from what we're saying. And so that becomes the overriding truth or blessing of the moment. And I almost never come up with those before COVID. Nowadays, but I feel like you're just pretending they're all here. But yeah, that's exactly what we do.
So then let's maybe end with Maria's question early on, which was, what exactly are we worshiping then?
You want to end with that? It's starting a whole nother thing.
Well, we need answers here, people. In all seriousness, let me ask it this way. How do you try to frame that for the folks that you're in community with, whatever that community looks like?
This is such a tough question because God, any God, is always made manifest through social construction and social understanding by a given community. And it's no different with Christianity. And, you know, I always encourage people, you know, if whether they're church shopping or religion shopping or whatever it is, it's like stay within your narrative that you've grown up and you've based your identity in, and evolve that narrative and innovate and reimagine and reconfigure that narrative. Because that's what you've kind of devoted, you know, the sacred part of your life to. And I hate even saying part, because I hate doing that disintegrated thing. It should be like our whole part, our whole bodies, right? But that's what I always encourage people to do and start with. It's like, who and what was the God that you were worshiping that you're now sort of trying to evolve onto something else? And like, what's the next migration of that particular God? And that might sound heretical, but then you'd have to call Brian McLaren heretical, because in his book, I think it's Spiritual Migration, he talks about God 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, you know, and he talks about what would have happened if we didn't have those 0.0 gods. He talks about what would have happened if we never moved on from like the apartheid God and the God of segregation, and we never, you know, innovated upon that God. And so, you know, we would all say we're Christians, but, you know, if you had a Trump supporting Christian on the conversation, or a Biden supporting, or whatever it is, we would define our gods as night and day different. And the other would be saying, nope, you don't worship our God. So, you know, I do firmly believe that like this sort of construct is made manifest and given life through community, and what fosters that spiritual, not spiritual really, but just what fosters transformation, what fosters meaning, what makes life worth sort of living, to go back to the Ogden quote earlier. But I'll stop there. Again, we could talk hours on this question. I'm sure everybody could.
That's great. How are you guys framing this for your communities? This question of like what we worship, who we worship.
I'll just briefly remark that I think our what questions are transforming into how questions. And that's something that we've just been embodying together. How are we living, you know? So.
Very well said, yeah.
I try to leave that as open as possible. Thomas Aquinas said to say God exists is to say that existence exists. And so your understanding of God can have a wide range of definitions and still fall within Christian orthodoxy, although I'm not afraid of heterodoxy. And if you're going to be dialogical, you kind of have to be minimally creedal at best, or maybe anti-creedal if that's going to work. The parts of the church tradition that have historically been dialogical, the Amish, the Mennonites, and whatnot, the Peace Church traditions have been anti-creedal or minimally creedal. So if you're going to make everyone kind of, you know, hit your bar, it's not going to work. You got to let that go. But within true orthodoxy, if you really, you know, study the church fathers and mothers and study even medieval theology, there's a wide range of possibilities that you can have and still fall within orthodoxy. And that's part of the deconstruction, is like this evangelical to fundamentalist lie that has been shoved down our throats has to be named for that. And so I'm just constantly giving people permission to reconceive God in a way that is helpful for them, and letting them know that that's okay. and they're not going to hell for it. And so that's how we do. We just leave that as widely, you know, because it is the whole, it is the apophatic, it is, you know, a lot of what God isn't and not much of what God is, because we can't really do more than, you know, beat around the edges.
Awesome. Amy, you get the last word, and do not feel pressured to define apophatic for our listeners.
That's great. I will say this. We are shifting here, and I'm shifting we started this conversation, or maybe it's before we hit record, about titles and what we do. My role here at First Christian is shifting mostly to spiritual direction, in that we're going to try and give everyone in the congregation the opportunity to have that deep listening and the opportunity of being vulnerable and fully seen, fully known, fully loved, with the hopes that then over time, I can touch base with these individuals and put them into groups of like-hearted individuals who can share life together. If we can have them gather in one another's homes, and we're talking like at the most 8 people to a group, 6 people ideally maybe, sharing meals, sharing stories. And then when we're able, maybe on those high holy days, maybe when we need each other most because we've lost a loved one, maybe when there's truly something to celebrate, we come together corporately. And wow, would that be a different experience of worship? And so that's sort of where we're headed. We're just in a holy experimentation phase, but it's the both and of individual spiritual direction and then pointing toward smaller shared communion, truly communion, Eucharistic worship, pointing toward maybe a time when we can all be together.
I love that. And I love that you are experimenting with that in a new setting. I know new to you. So blessings to you on that. On that note, it's 1:01 p.m. and we're supposed to be done at 1 p.m. So I want to honor your time and say thank you very much. We've already lost Reverend Tim Burnett from the Way Collective. So thanks to him because he had to jump on his next call. Thanks so much, Amy Pyatt. So good to have you on one of these calls. I believe I have you booked for another one, I hope, right?
I think so.
I think so. I think
I'll be there.
Yeah, I think it might be a future of discipleship. So thank you very much. Reverend Dr. Michael Rayburn, thanks again for your time. I'm glad that we were able to make this work. I know that at first you thought you had a conflict, but always super appreciative of your insights. And Maria French, always a pleasure. I am being prayerful that you will get to Europe sometime soon. I know that's where your heart is.
Thank you so much. And it was such an honor to dialogue with these very esteemed colleagues this afternoon. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. You guys have a great day.
Bye, everyone.